I don't need flowers. I just need someone to come. Evelyn Harper's voice cracked as she said it, her spotted hands trembling on top of the counter, and the funeral director behind that counter forgot for a moment how to breathe. 95 years old, alone, already picking out her own casket because she was terrified that when her time came, not a single soul on this earth would bother to show up. If you are watching this story right now, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story travels, the same way it traveled across an entire country. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe, because what happened to Evelyn Harper 3 weeks later is something none of us will ever forget. Silver Creek, Montana wasn't the kind of town people wrote songs about. It was the kind of town people drove through on their way to somewhere else, a scattering of low buildings pressed against the base of the mountains, a gas station with one working pump, a diner that had been serving the same coffee for 40 years, and a funeral home at the edge of town that most residents tried not to think about until they absolutely had to. Evelyn Harper had lived in Silver Creek her entire life. She had been born 3 miles from where she now sat in a farmhouse that no longer existed, delivered by a midwife who had died decades before Evelyn's own husband passed. She had married young, buried her husband old, and outlived a son who should have buried her instead. That morning, she woke up the way she woke up every morning, alone in a bed too big for one person in a house that had grown so quiet over the years that she sometimes talked to herself just to remember what her own voice sounded like. She made her tea. She looked at the photograph on her nightstand, the one of her husband Frank in his army uniform, young and smiling, and so sure that the whole world was still ahead of him. She looked at the other photograph beside it, the one of her son Michael, 12 years old, gap-toothed, holding up a fish he'd caught in the creek that gave the town its name. Frank had been gone 18 years. Michael had been gone 11. And everyone else, her sister, her closest friend, Dottie from church, the neighbors who used to bring over casseroles when things got hard, they were all gone, too scattered across cemeteries and nursing homes in the simple, unstoppable erosion of time. Evelyn picked up her purse. She put on her coat, the good one, the navy blue wool coat she saved for important occasions. And she walked slowly, leaning on her cane 3 blocks down Main Street to Callahan's funeral home, because she had made a decision the night before that she could no longer put off. She was going to plan her own funeral. Not because she was sick, not because a doctor had given her bad news. She was going to plan it because she had lain awake the previous night doing the math in her head, counting on her fingers the people who might still be alive to attend, and she had run out of fingers before she'd found 5 names. The bell above the door chimed when she walked in, and a young man rose from behind the front desk. His name tag read Daniel Reyes, Funeral Director, and he could not have been older than 35, with the careful, gentle demeanor of someone who had learned to sit with grief every single day of his working life. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I'd like to talk about arrangements," Evelyn said. "For myself." Daniel's expression softened in the particular way that told Evelyn he had done this before many times with many elderly people who walked through that door alone. He guided her to a small office in the back, offered her water, which she declined, and sat down across from her with a folder and a pen. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." "There's always a rush at my age," Evelyn said, and there was a dry humor in it that made Daniel almost smile despite himself. "I don't have decades to plan this the way some people do." They went through the basics. The casket, she wanted something simple, nothing extravagant. She said money should be saved for the church roof rather than wasted on mahogany. The burial plot, she already had one beside Frank, purchased 40 years earlier, when they'd been young enough to think about death as an abstract concept rather than an appointment on the calendar. The music she wanted, How Great Thou Art, the same hymn they'd played at Frank's service, the same hymn her mother had loved. Then Daniel asked this question he asked every family, every client, out of professional habit more than anything else. "And who should we contact, family, close friends, anyone you'd like us to reach out to when the time comes to make sure they're informed?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Daniel weighted his pen, hovering over the paper, and when he looked up from the folder, he saw something in her face that made his stomach tighten. Not sadness exactly, but something quieter and heavier. Something that looked almost like shame. "There isn't anyone," Evelyn finally said. Daniel set his pen down slowly. "Ma'am, my husband's gone, my son's gone, my sister passed 6 years ago. My closest friend, Dottie, she went into a home in Bozeman, and I haven't heard from her family since she died there 2 winters back." I don't have children besides Michael, and I don't have grandchildren because Michael never. Her voice caught just slightly, and she pressed her lips together until she'd steadied herself. There isn't anyone left to call. The room went very still. What about the church? Daniel asked gently. Surely your congregation would want to know. I stopped attending 3 years ago. My hip made the stairs too difficult, and Pastor Williams retired, and the new one doesn't know my name. Evelyn folded her hands in her sword, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, something so raw that Daniel would remember it for the rest of his career. I don't need flowers. I don't need a big service or a eulogy or people saying nice things about a life they didn't really know. I just need someone to come. I just need there to be a person standing there so that when they lower me into the ground, it isn't just me and the man digging the hole. Daniel Reyes had buried hundreds of people. He had comforted hundreds of grieving families. But something about the plainness of that request, the sheer smallness of it, not asking for grandeur, not asking for wealth or recognition, just asking not to be alone in the ground the way she had been alone in the years leading up to it, nearly broke him where he sat. Mrs. Harper, he said carefully, I promise you when the time comes we will make certain. You don't have to promise anything, dear, Evelyn interrupted, and she managed a small, tired smile. The kind of smile that had learned long ago how to hide the worst of its pain. I know how these things work. You'll do your part, and it'll be a fine service, and maybe a few strangers will wander in because they saw the notice in the paper. That's enough. That's more than some people get. She finished the paperwork. She wrote a check for the deposit. She thanked Daniel for his kindness, and she walked back out onto Main Street into the thin Montana sunlight, and if anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen an old woman who had just quietly, methodically arranged the end of her own story and had done it entirely alone. What Evelyn Harper did not know, could not have possibly known, was that 4 hours later, at a roadside diner half a mile from her house, she was about to say those same words to a stranger. And that stranger was about to change everything. The Silver Creek Diner smelled the way it always smelled: burnt coffee, bacon grease, and the particular mustiness of vinyl booths that had absorbed 40 years of spilled drinks and quiet conversations. Evelyn came here twice a week, always alone, and always ordering the same thing: a bowl of vegetable soup and a cup of decaf, because the doctor had told her caffeine wasn't good for her heart anymore. She was sitting in her usual booth by the window when the door swung open, and the whole diner seemed to shift its attention toward the noise. Boots, heavy ones, the creak of leather. A man walked in who filled the doorway before he even stepped through it, broad-shouldered, silver-bearded, wearing a black leather vest with patches sewn across the back that most of the regulars in that diner recognized immediately. HELLS Angels. Jackson Mercer Hawk, to everyone who knew him, had ridden 200 miles that morning to visit an old riding buddy in the hospital in Bozeman, a man he'd known for 30 years who was fighting a battle with his lungs that he was slowly losing. Hawk had left that hospital room with his jaw tight and his eyes red the way a man's eyes get red when he's spent an hour holding a dying friend's hand and pretending he wasn't scared. He needed food. He needed coffee. He needed 5 minutes where he didn't have to think about mortality, and Silver Creek Diner had been the first place he'd seen with its lights on. He sat down 2 booths away from Evelyn and the waitress, a heavy-set woman named Carol, who had worked there for 22 years, brought him a menu without blinking an eye, because bikers passed through Silver Creek often enough on their way through the mountains that nobody thought much of it anymore. Hawk ordered black coffee and a burger. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through nothing in particular, tried to shake the image of his friend's hollow cheeks out of his head. And that was when he heard it. 2 booths away, Evelyn Harper was talking to Carol, who had stopped by to refill her water glass, and out of simple small-town kindness asked how she was doing. "Oh, I'm fine, dear," Evelyn said in the automatic way old women say they're fine when they are anything but. "Just came from Callahan's, finally got my affairs sorted." Carol's face fell. "Your affairs, Evelyn. My funeral, dear. No sense putting it off any longer at my age." Evelyn said this so lightly, so matter-of-factly, that Carol didn't quite know how to respond, and in the small silence that followed, Evelyn added almost to herself in a voice she probably thought no one else could hear. "I told the young man there, I don't need flowers. I just need someone to come." Carol's hand found Evelyn's shoulder, a brief, helpless squeeze before she was called away to another table, leaving Evelyn alone again with her soup and her thoughts. But 2 booths away, Hawk Mercer had gone completely still. He had ridden with the Hells Angels for 31 years. He had stood over the graves of more brothers than he could count, on both hands had watched grown men weep at funerals, had felt the particular helplessness of a room too full of grief and too empty of answers. But he had never in all those years heard anyone say something that hollowed him out the way that sentence had. I just need someone to come. He thought of his own mother who had died with a church full of people around her. He thought of his brothers in the club who had promised each other decades ago that no one who rode with them would ever be buried without a proper send-off, without brothers standing vigil, without the roar of pipes to announce that a life had mattered. And here was a stranger, an old woman with kind eyes and a navy blue coat, sitting alone in a diner, quietly certain that when she died, nobody would show up at all. Hawk set down his coffee. He sat there for a long moment arguing with himself because he was not a man who inserted himself into strangers' business. 30 years on the road had taught him that people didn't always want a giant biker showing up uninvited in their private grief. But something about the way she'd said it, I just need someone to come, wouldn't let him sit still. He stood up. He walked the short distance between booths, and Evelyn looked up at him with the mild, unbothered curiosity of a woman who had lived long enough not to be afraid of much of anything, including a large stranger in leather approaching her table. "Ma'am," Hawk said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overhear, but I heard what you said to the waitress." Evelyn blinked up at him. "Oh, about your funeral." Hawk swallowed. About needing someone to come. For a moment, embarrassment flickered across Evelyn's face. The particular embarrassment of an old woman realizing her private sorrow had been overheard by a total stranger. "That's not something I meant for the whole diner to hear," she said, managing a small wry smile. "But yes, that's about the size of it." "Can I sit?" Hawk asked. Evelyn studied him for a moment. The silver beard, the leather vest, the tattoos climbing up his forearms, the patches on his chest that told a story she didn't fully understand but recognized as belonging to a world entirely separate from her own quiet life. And then, because she was 95 years old and had decided a long time ago that fear was mostly a waste of the time she had left, she gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit down, young man. You look like you've had a hard morning too." Hawk almost laughed at being called young at 56, but he sat, and for the next 20 minutes in a diner booth in a town neither of them would have called, significant something happened that neither of them expected. Evelyn told him everything. She told him about Frank, about the war he'd survived, and the cancer that finally got him. She told him about Michael, about the accident on the highway outside of Billings that had taken him at 43, leaving behind no children, no wife, nothing but an empty bedroom in Evelyn's house that she still couldn't bring herself to clean out. She told him about Dottie, about the church, about the slow grinding way loneliness accumulates in a person's life, the way rust accumulates on an old car left out in the weather. Not all at once, but persistently, until one day you look up and realize the whole thing is covered. Hawk listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes or rush to fill the silences the way people sometimes do when grief makes them uncomfortable. He just listened the way he'd learned to listen at hospital bedsides and graveside services for 31 years. And when Evelyn finally finished, when she sat back in the booth, looking almost startled by how much she'd said to a total stranger, Hawk reached across the table. He didn't touch her. He just rested his hand flat on the table between them, an offering rather than an intrusion. And he said the only thing that felt true, "Ma'am, you won't be alone." Evelyn let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has heard kind words before and learned not to build anything on top of them. "That's sweet of you to say, dear, but you don't need to make promises to an old woman you just met." "I'm not making a promise I don't intend to keep," Hawk said, and something in his voice had changed steadier. Now harder, the voice of a man used to being taken at his word. "When's the service going to be?" "Not, I don't mean anytime soon. I mean if something happened tomorrow. Where would it be?" "Callahan's is handling the arrangements." "St. Andrew's Cemetery, out past the Miller farm." Evelyn tilted her head, studying him with new curiosity. "Why on earth would that matter to you?" Hawk didn't answer right away. He was thinking already. Thinking in that fast, decisive way men like him thought when something mattered, about phone numbers, about chapters, about the network of brothers and sisters spread out across 5 states who had ridden together for decades and had never once let each other down when it counted. Because, he said slowly, I don't think you understand what kind of people you're talking to right now. Evelyn frowned, not understanding, and Hawk almost told her everything right then. Almost told her about the club, about the code they live by, about the particular fierce loyalty that bikers extended, not just to each other, but sometimes in moments like this, to strangers who needed it most. But something told him not to. Something told him that if he made this promise too loudly, too specifically, it would sound like a kindness offered in the moment and forgotten by the time he pulled out of the parking lot. So instead, he simply said, "You believe maybe 4 people might show up, am I right?" Evelyn's eyes widened slightly. "How did you lucky guess?" Hawk's jaw tightened. "What if I told you it'll be more than 4 times? I'd tell you that you're a kind man for saying so and that I appreciate it, but I have lived long enough to know how these things go." Evelyn's smile turned sad. "People mean well, but people are busy. People forget." Hawk stood up from the booth. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn business card, Hawk Mercer, and beneath it a phone number, nothing else, and set it gently on the table in front of her. "Keep this," he said. "And ma'am, I know you don't know me from Adam, but where I come from, when we make a promise, we don't break it. Not for anything." He walked out of the diner without ordering the burger he had asked for, and Evelyn Harper sat alone in her booth holding a stranger's business card, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not quite hope, because hope felt too dangerous to trust, but something adjacent to it. Something that made her chest ache in a way that wasn't entirely sad. She had no idea that the moment Hawk Mercer walked out that door and swung his leg over his motorcycle, her quiet private plea had already begun to travel farther than she could possibly imagine. Hawk sat on his bike in the parking lot for almost 10 minutes before he started the engine. He thought about his own mother's funeral 20 years earlier. The church so full that people had stood in the vestibule, the line of mourners stretching out the door and down the block. He thought about how much comfort that had given him in the middle of the worst grief of his life, just to see how many people had shown up to say his mother had mattered. And he thought about Evelyn Harper, sitting alone in a diner booth, calmly planning a funeral she expected almost nobody to attend. He pulled out his phone, he scrolled to the group chat that connected him to chapter presidents across 4 states. Men and women he'd ridden with for decades, brothers and sisters who had stood beside him through funerals, weddings, hospital vigils, and everything in between. His thumb hovered over the keyboard for a long moment. Then he typed, 95-year-old woman, Silver Creek, Montana. No family left, husband and son, both gone. No other relatives, no church family anymore. She just planned her own funeral today and told the funeral director she doesn't need flowers, she just needs someone to come. She thinks maybe 4 people will show up. Let's prove her wrong. He read it over twice. Then before he could talk himself out of it, he hit send. He had no idea in that moment exactly what he was about to unleash. Within 4 minutes, the first reply came through from Big Tom Delacroix, chapter president 200 miles east in Billings, a mountain of a man who had lost his own grandmother to loneliness in a nursing home years earlier and had never quite forgiven himself for not visiting more. I'm in. Send me the date in the cemetery. I'll be there if I have to ride through a blizzard. Then another, and another. Within 20 minutes, Hawk's phone was buzzing so continuously that he had to pull it out of his pocket 3 separate times just to keep up. Chapter presidents were forwarding his message to their own members. Members were forwarding it to friends outside the club, veterans groups, riding clubs that weren't affiliated with the Angels, and all ordinary men and women who simply couldn't read the words "no family left." She thinks 4 people will come without feeling something crack open in their chest. By that evening, what had started as a single message between old friends had become something else entirely, a current running through phone lines and group chats across half the country, carrying with it a single simple, unstoppable idea. Nobody who spends a lifetime loving people deserves to leave this world alone. Hawk didn't tell Evelyn any of this, not that first day. He worried if he told her too soon, too specifically, that she wouldn't believe him, or worse, that she'd spend whatever time she had left anxious, waiting, wondering if the promise would actually be kept. So instead, over the following days, he simply began showing up. He came back to the diner 3 days later, sat across from her again, asked about Frank, asked about Michael, asked about the little details of her life that most people had stopped asking about years ago. What her favorite hymn was, what flowers she used to grow before her hip made gardening too difficult, whether she still had the recipe for the pie her mother used to make. Evelyn, for her part, found herself looking forward to those visits in a way that frightened her slightly, the way anything precious frightens a person who has lost too much to trust easily. "You don't have to keep checking on an old woman," she told him the third time he visited, though there was no real protest in her voice. "Maybe I like the company," Hawk said, which was true, though it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was unfolding 200 miles away and 300 miles away, and by the end of that first week in towns Evelyn Harper had never even heard of. In Missoula, a woman named Renata Vasquez, a nurse who had spent 15 years working hospice care, who had held the hands of countless dying patients whose families never came, read Hawk's forwarded message on her phone during a break between shifts and had to step into a supply closet to cry. She had seen this exact scenario play out too many times in her career. The elderly, the forgotten, the ones who slipped away with only a nurse's hand to hold. She texted her chapter immediately. "Count me in. I'll drive through the night if I have to." In Coeur d'Alene, a retired Marine named Frank Doyle, coincidentally sharing a first name with the husband Evelyn had buried 18 years earlier, read the message while sitting in his garage staring at a motorcycle. He hadn't ridden in months since his own wife's death had left him feeling like there wasn't much point in riding anywhere anymore. Something about the story cracked something loose in him. He hadn't felt purpose in a long time. He felt it now. In Great Falls, a young mechanic named Danny Okafor, only 26 years old, not even fully patched into his chapter yet, read the message between customers at the auto shop where he worked and immediately asked his boss for the day off 3 weeks in advance, for a reason he could barely explain, except to say, "There's a woman who needs us to show up." One by one, then dozens by dozens riders across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and beyond began rearranging their lives around a single date on a calendar, a date for a funeral that hadn't happened yet, for a woman most of them would never meet before that day, because something in Hawk's message had reached past logic and landed directly in the place where people kept their oldest wounds. Some of them had buried their own parents with almost no one in attendance. Some of them had felt in their own lives the particular terror of growing old without family, without anyone left to remember them. Some of them simply couldn't stand the thought of a 95-year-old woman spending her final months believing with quiet, dignified certainty that the world had already forgotten her before she was even gone. By the end of the second week, Hawk's original message, 95-year-old woman, no family left, she thinks 4 people will come, had traveled through more than a dozen chapters across 4 states. Riders who had never met each other, who belonged to different clubs entirely, who under normal circumstances might never have crossed paths, found themselves united by the same 3 words circulating through every conversation. "Let's prove her wrong." Hawk kept a private count on a notepad in his kitchen, a habit that had started almost as a joke and had quickly become something closer to a sacred obligation. Every night after his visits to Evelyn, he would sit at his kitchen table and update the tally, watching a number grow that he had never anticipated when he'd sent that first simple message. 12 confirmed the first night, 31 by the end of the first week, 68 10 days in. The number kept climbing and climbing and climbing in a way that made Hawk's chest tight every time he added a new name to the list. Not with anxiety, but with something closer to awe. The particular awe of watching an act of kindness take on a life larger than the person who first set it in motion. He hadn't told Evelyn any specific number. He hadn't told her about the group chats, the phone trees, the veterans organizations that had heard about the plan and quietly asked to be included. He hadn't told her that riders were already mapping routes, already checking weather reports for the week of the funeral, already making arrangements with their employers to take time off for a woman they had never met. He only told her every time he visited the same simple thing. "You're not going to be alone, Evelyn. I promise you that." And every time Evelyn would pat his hand and say something gentle and slightly sad, something like, "You're a good man, Jackson. I hope you know that whatever happens, just you sitting here with me has meant more than you'll ever understand." She still believed in her heart that when the day came, it would be Hawk, maybe Carol from the diner, maybe Daniel from the funeral home out of professional kindness, and perhaps a stranger or 2 who'd seen the notice in the local paper. 4 people. 5 if she was lucky. She had absolutely no idea that at that very moment in towns and cities she had never visited, and would never visit more than 100 people she had never met, were already marking a date on their calendars, already checking the air pressure in their tires, already telling their families, I have to go somewhere important. There's a woman in Montana who needs us. She had no idea that a Hawk's Kitchen notepad, if she had seen it, would have shown a number that had already climbed past 140 confirmed riders, with more calling in every single day from clubs and chapters she had never heard of, from veterans she had never met, from strangers who had heard her story secondhand and thirdhand and had decided without hesitation that they needed to be part of it. And she certainly had no idea that 3 weeks from that quiet conversation in a diner booth, the sleepy streets of Silver Creek, Montana, would fill with a sound the town had never heard before, a sound that would announce louder than any words ever could that Evelyn Harper had been wrong about one very important thing. She was never going to be alone again. On the 17th day since Hawk had first sent his message, something happened that nearly unraveled everything. Evelyn fell. It happened in her kitchen, a simple misstep, reaching for a teacup on a high shelf, her hip giving out the way it sometimes threatened to do, and she went down hard against the linoleum floor alone, with no one to hear her cry out except the empty walls of a house that had held her solitude for 18 years. She lay there for almost 40 minutes before she managed to drag herself to the phone. When Hawk got the call from Daniel Reyes at the funeral home, who had heard about it from Carol at the diner, who had heard about it from the paramedic, who happened to be a regular customer, his stomach dropped in a way it hadn't dropped in years. Is she all right? He demanded, already pulling his boots on, already reaching for his keys. She broke her wrist, bruised her hip pretty bad. She's at Silver Creek Medical, but Hawk, Daniel's voice hesitated. The doctor's concerned. At her age, a fall like this, it can be the beginning of the end. He wants to keep her under observation. He's talking about whether she should even be living alone anymore. Hawk was in the truck within 90 seconds, driving faster than he should have toward the small clinic at the edge of town, his mind racing with a single terrifying thought. What if she doesn't make it long enough to see what we've built for her? What if all of this, the 140 riders, the calls, the promises, comes 1 week too late? He arrived at the clinic to find Evelyn propped up in a hospital bed, her wrist in a cast, her face pale, but her eyes still sharp, still stubbornly alert despite everything. Oh, don't look at me like that, she scolded him the moment he walked in, though her voice was weaker than he'd ever heard it. I've fallen before. I'll fall again before I finally go. It's part of getting old. You scared me half to death, Hawk said, and his voice cracked in a way that surprised even him. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. You really do care, don't you? She said quietly. I keep waiting for you to stop coming around. People usually do. I'm not people, Hawk said, and I'm not going anywhere. The doctor pulled Hawk aside in the hallway a few minutes later, his voice low and grave. She's stable, but I want to be honest with you, a woman her age living alone with no family to check on her falls like this happen again. And next time she might not make it to the phone. Hawk stood in that hallway with his fists clenched, thinking about the number on his kitchen notepad, thinking about the 140 riders already committed to a funeral that was supposed to happen someday, months or years down the road, and feeling for the first time the terrifying possibility that someday might arrive far sooner than any of them were ready for. He walked back into Evelyn's room. He sat down beside her bed, took her uninjured hand gently in his own, and made a decision he hadn't planned on making that day. Well, Evelyn, he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually believe me this time. Evelyn looked at him, waiting, her pale eyes steady despite the pain still etched across her face. That first day in the diner, when I told you that you wouldn't be alone, Hawk took a breath. I didn't just mean me showing up. I sent a message to my club, to brothers and sisters across 4 states. And Evelyn, his voice thickened. It's not 4 people who are planning to come to your funeral anymore. Evelyn's brow furrowed. Jackson, what are you saying? I'm saying there are over 140 riders right now who've already committed to being there. Veterans, nurses, mechanics, people who've never even met you who heard your story and couldn't stand the thought of you thinking you'd be alone. He squeezed her hand carefully around the cast, and that number's still growing, every single day. Evelyn stared at him, and for a long moment she said absolutely nothing at all. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes searching his face for some sign that this was a joke, a kindness stretched too far, a comfort offered to a frightened old woman lying in a hospital bed. That can't be true, she finally whispered. It's true, Hawk said. every word. 140 people, Evelyn repeated, as though saying the number out loud might make it collapse under its own impossible weight. People I've never met, coming for me. Not just for you, Hawk said gently, for what you represent to them. For every person who's ever been afraid of dying alone. You have no idea, Evelyn, how many people out there needed a reason to believe that kindness like this still exists in the world. You gave them that reason without even knowing it. Tears slipping down Evelyn's weathered cheeks, tears she didn't bother wiping away, tears that came from somewhere so deep and so old that they seemed to carry the weight of 18 years of loneliness, finally beginning just slightly to lift. I don't understand, she said softly. Why would strangers do this for me? Hawk thought about his answer for a long moment before he gave it. Because somewhere along the way, Evelyn, this world convinced a lot of good people that nobody was watching out for each other anymore. And then you walked into a funeral home and said one true heartbreaking sentence, and it reminded every single one of us why we started riding together in the first place. He paused, his throat tight. You didn't ask for 140 people, Evelyn. You just asked not to be alone. But sometimes when the ask is that simple and that true, people can't help themselves. They show up anyway. All of them. Evelyn Harper lay in that hospital bed, her broken wrist aching, her whole body exhausted from the fall, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to cry. Not from grief, not from loneliness, but from something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Being wanted, being remembered before she was even gone. She had walked into Callahan's funeral home 3 weeks earlier, believing with quiet resignation that her life would end the way it had spent its final years, small forgotten, unremarkable to a world too busy to notice one more elderly widow slipping away. She had no idea that her simple, heartbroken sentence had already traveled across 4 states into the hands of strangers who refused to let that happen. And she had absolutely no idea that the number climbing on Hawk Mercer's kitchen notepad, 140 growing by the day, was still nowhere close to where it would eventually land. Somewhere out there in towns Evelyn Harper had never visited, motorcycles were already being tuned. Vests were already being pressed, and a date was circled on calendars belonging to people who had never once shaken her hand. They were coming, all of them. And Silver Creek, Montana had absolutely no idea what was about to arrive on its quiet streets. Evelyn Harper spent 6 days in that hospital bed before the doctor finally agreed to release her, and every single one of those 6 days, Hawk Mercer showed up before visiting hours even officially started. You're going to get thrown out one of these mornings, Evelyn told him on the 4th day, watching him settle into the chair beside her bed with the ease of a man who had claimed that spot as his own. Let them try, Hawk said, and the nurse standing in the doorway, a woman named Patty who had worked that floor for 11 years, just laughed and shook her head. Because by that point, the entire staff had stopped questioning why a broad-shouldered biker in a leather vest had practically moved into room 114. But underneath the easy banter, something had shifted in Hawk since the night he'd told Evelyn about the 140 riders. He had seen in her hospital bed exactly how fragile this whole thing was, how close he had come to making a promise to a woman who might not have lived long enough to see it kept. That fear sat in his chest like a stone, and it changed the way he moved through every single day that followed. He stopped waiting for the funeral to prove something. He decided Evelyn needed to see proof now while she was still breathing, still able to understand what she meant to people who had never even met her. On the 5th day, sitting in that hospital chair, Hawk pulled out his phone and made a call he hadn't planned on making. Renata, he said when the nurse in Missoula picked up, I need a favor. Actually, I need more than a favor. I need you to come see her. Not for the funeral now. Renata Vasquez didn't hesitate. Give me 3 hours. Evelyn was dozing when the knock came at her hospital room door, and when she opened her eyes, she found a stranger standing there. A woman in her 40s with kind, tired eyes and a nurse's badge clipped to a leather vest that made her look like she belonged to 2 entirely different worlds at once. Mrs. Harper, Renata said softly, my name is Renata. I drove 3 hours to meet you. Evelyn blinked, confused, glancing at Hawk, who simply nodded for her to listen. I've spent 15 years doing hospice work. Renata continued, pulling a chair closer to the bed. I've held the hands of more dying strangers than I can count because their own families never came. And when Hawk sent his message about you, I sat in a supply closet at the hospital and cried because I've seen your story play out 100 times and it broke something open in me every single time. You drove 3 hours, Evelyn repeated, still not quite believing it, just to tell me that I drove 3 hours, Renata said, because I needed you to know, while you're still here, still able to hear it, you already mattered to me. You mattered before I ever saw your face. And I will be standing at that cemetery when the day comes, no matter what else is happening in my life that week. Evelyn's chin trembled. She reached out with her uninjured hand and Renata took it without hesitation, and for a long moment, neither woman said anything at all, because nothing needed to be said. That was the first mini-miracle. It would not be the last. The following morning, a second knock came, and this time it was Frank Doyle, the retired Marine from Coeur d'Alene, standing awkwardly in the doorway with his cap in his hands like a schoolboy, uncertain whether he was allowed inside. "Ma'am," he said, "I know we've never met, but my wife passed 8 months ago, and since then I haven't found much reason to get out of my garage. Your story gave me a reason. I wanted you to know that before I ever put a helmet on for your sake." Evelyn propped up against her pillows, looked at this stranger, this weathered, broad-shouldered man who had crossed state lines just to speak 11 sentences to her, and something in her chest cracked wide open in a way that had nothing to do with her broken wrist. "Why," she whispered, "why does an old woman in Montana matter this much to people I've never met?" Frank considered the question seriously, the way a man considers a question he's been asking himself the entire drive over. "Because most of us are scared of exactly what you were scared of," he finally said. "Dying and having nobody notice. You just said it out loud. And when somebody says the quiet thing everybody's afraid of, ma'am, it does something to people. It reminds them they're not the only one carrying that fear around." Hawk stood by the window watching this unfold, and he understood in that moment that what he had started 3 weeks earlier in a diner booth had already outgrown him entirely. It wasn't his movement anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever lain awake at night, wondering if they'd mattered to anyone when their time finally came. By the time Evelyn was discharged from the hospital, wrist and a cast hip still aching, 3 more strangers had visited her, a veteran, a school teacher whose own grandmother had died in a nursing home with no visitors, and a teenage boy whose grandfather rode with Hawk's chapter, who'd begged his mother to let him skip school to come say thank you to a woman he'd never met for reminding his grandfather what riding was supposed to mean. Evelyn went home to a house that suddenly didn't feel quite so silent because her phone, an old flip phone she rarely used, had started ringing with numbers she didn't recognize. Riders from 3 states calling, just to introduce themselves, just to say her name out loud, and let her hear a stranger's voice say it warmly. But not everyone in Silver Creek was celebrating. 10 days after Evelyn came home, a town council meeting was called ostensibly about road maintenance, but everyone who attended knew the real reason the room was packed tighter than it had been in years. Mayor Gerald Whitfield, a stiff, balding man who had run Silver Creek's local government for 19 years, stood at the podium with a stack of papers in his hand and a deep furrow between his brows. "I've been getting calls," he announced to the crowded room, "from residents concerned about reports that as many as 200 motorcycles may be descending on this town for a funeral. 200. I want to be very clear that this council was not consulted, and frankly, I have serious concerns about noise, about traffic safety on roads that were not built for that kind of volume, and about the image this puts forward of Silver Creek." A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel Reyes, sitting near the back, felt his stomach tighten. "With respect, Mayor," came a voice from the third row. Carol, the diner waitress, standing up with her apron still on because she'd come straight from her shift. "This is about an old woman who's lived in this town her whole life being told nobody would show up when she died. Now people are showing up. I don't see the problem." "The problem," Whitfield said stiffly, "is 200 motorcycles on Miller Road, which is barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass. The problem is liability. The problem is that this began as a kind gesture and appears to be turning into a spectacle." Hawk stood at the very back of that room, arms crossed, jaw tight, and when Whitfield's eyes landed on him, on the leather vest, the patches, the whole unmistakable presence of him, the mayor's voice took on a sharper, more pointed edge. "And I have to ask," Whitfield continued, "whether this club has considered that a woman that age, that frail, might find the whole thing overwhelming. Has anyone actually asked Mrs. Harper what she wants? Or has this become more about the club's image than her well-being?" The room went quiet in a different way now, a tense, waiting silence, and Hawk felt every eye turned toward him. He stepped forward slowly. "Mayor Whitfield," he said, his voice low and even, "I understand you've got real concerns about traffic and safety, and I'll work with your sheriff's department on every single one of them. We'll coordinate routes, we'll manage parking, we'll follow whatever safety plan your deputies want to put in place. That's not up for debate. I'll cooperate with all of it." He paused, letting that land before he continued. "But don't stand up there and question whether we've asked Evelyn what she wants. I sat with that woman in a hospital bed 6 days ago and told her myself exactly what was happening. I watched her cry, not from fear, sir, but because for the first time in 18 years, somebody told her she mattered enough for strangers to rearrange their whole lives around her. If you want to question something, question why it took a room full of leather-vested strangers to make a 95-year-old woman in your own town feel like she still counted for something." The silence that followed was absolute. Then from the third row, an elderly man Hawk didn't recognize stood up slowly, leaning on a wooden cane of his own. "I've lived here longer than most of you," the old man said, his voice trembling with age, but firm with conviction. "I remember when Evelyn Harper organized the town's entire flood relief effort back in '78, feeding half this town and out of her own kitchen for 2 weeks straight when the creek overran its banks. This town owes her more than a worry about traffic on Miller Road." Another voice rose from the crowd, a younger woman this time. "My mother was in the church choir with Evelyn for 20 years. She used to bring soup to every single family that had a baby in the hospital. Every single one. Nobody ever organized 200 people to say thank you to her while she could still hear it. And now that somebody finally is, we're worried about noise complaints." Whitfield's face reddened. He shuffled his papers, clearly caught off guard by a room that had turned against him faster than he'd expected. "I'm not saying we shouldn't allow it," he said, backpedaling. "I'm saying it needs to be managed properly." "Then let's manage it properly," Hawk said, extending a hand across the small distance between them. "I'll meet with your sheriff this week. We'll have a full route plan, parking coordination, everything your town needs to feel comfortable. But we are not turning back 200 people who are coming to honor a woman this whole town apparently already loved and somehow forgot to show it." Whitfield hesitated for a long moment before finally shaking Hawk's hand, more out of the pressure of a room clearly against him than any real change of heart. But it was enough. The meeting ended and Daniel Reyes caught up with Hawk in the parking lot afterward, shaking his head with something between disbelief and admiration. "You just talked down an entire town council," Daniel said. "I didn't do that," Hawk said quietly, glancing back at the building where the room was still slowly emptying. "This town did that. Turns out they remembered who Evelyn was before we ever showed up. They just needed a reason to say it out loud." That night, word of the council meeting reached Evelyn through Carol, who stopped by with a container of soup and couldn't stop talking about how the whole town had practically erupted in her defense. Evelyn sat in her kitchen chair, absorbing the story slowly, her eyes glistening. "I organized soup for 2 weeks during a flood almost 50 years ago," she murmured. "I didn't think anyone remembered that." "Everybody remembered it," Carol said. "They just never told you." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her cast, at the fragile bones underneath it that had carried her through 95 years of a life she had genuinely believed until 3 weeks ago nobody would remember. "Maybe," she said softly, "the problem was never that people forgot. Maybe the problem was that nobody ever says it until it's too late to hear." That single sentence repeated by Carol to Hawk the next day, by Hawk to Renata over the phone, by Renata to a hospice support group she led in Missoula, the following week began circulating in its own quiet way, smaller than the funeral movement, but no less powerful, a ripple that would eventually reach further than any of them realized. But the momentum building around Evelyn Harper was about to face its most serious test yet. 2 weeks after the town council meeting, a car Evelyn didn't recognize pulled into her driveway, a sleek black sedan entirely out of place among the pickup trucks and dust of Silver Creek's residential streets. A man in an expensive suit stepped out mid-40s carrying a leather briefcase, and Evelyn watched him approach her front porch with the particular wariness of a woman who had learned over 95 years that strangers in suits rarely brought good news. "Mrs. Harper," the man said, "My name is Gregory Ashford. I'm an attorney. I represent a client who believes he may be a relative of yours, a great-nephew through your late husband's side of the family. Robert Franklin Harper." Evelyn's breath caught. "Frank's brother's grandson," she said slowly. "I haven't heard that name in over 30 years. Frank's brother moved to California before Frank and I ever married. We lost touch decades ago. My client became aware of your situation through some local news coverage." Ashford said, his tone carefully professional. The story of the funeral, the volunteer riders, it's gained some regional attention. He'd like to reconnect. He's asked me to inquire about visiting you, and given your age and circumstances, to discuss matters related to your estate. Something in Evelyn's chest went cold. My estate, she repeated flatly. It's simply a conversation, Mrs. Harper. Nothing needs to be decided today. Evelyn had not heard from a single member of Frank's family in over 3 decades. Not a birthday card, not a condolence letter when Frank died, not a word of comfort when Michael passed. And now the moment her story reached a wider audience, the moment 200 strangers had begun preparing to honor her, a relative she had never met in her adult life had suddenly remembered her existence with a lawyer in a briefcase and a very specific interest in her estate. Get off my porch, Evelyn said, her voice trembling with something that wasn't fear. Mrs. Harper, I said, get off my porch. Her voice rose sharper than Hawk had ever heard it, sharper than she'd probably raised it in years. For 30 years, nobody in that family cared whether I lived or died. Now suddenly there's a lawyer on my porch talking about my estate the same month strangers on motorcycles decided I mattered enough to show up for. You tell your client I don't need his sudden concern, and I certainly don't need his interest in whatever's left after I'm gone. Ashford, to his credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable. He left a business card on her porch railing, along with a quiet apology, and drove away, leaving Evelyn standing in her doorway, shaking with an anger that surprised even her. When Hawk arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by a frantic call from Carol, who'd witnessed the whole exchange from across the street, he found Evelyn sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the business card like it was a poisonous thing. They only came because of the story, she said quietly before Hawk could even ask. 30 years of silence, and the moment strangers care about me, my own family suddenly remembers I exist. Only because there might be something left to inherit. Hawk sat down across from her, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger of his own. You want me to handle this, he asked, because I know people who can make sure that man never sets foot on your porch again. No, Evelyn said, surprising him. I don't need threats. I just need you to understand something, Jackson. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the tears gathering at their edges. The people coming to my funeral aren't coming because of blood or inheritance or obligation. They're coming because they chose to. That family out there, they're coming because of what they might get. There's a difference between people who show up because they have to and people who show up because they want to. I know now which one actually matters. Hawk reached across the table and squeezed her uninjured hand. You know what's funny, he said quietly. That's exactly what half the riders on my list would say about their own families. Some of them haven't spoken to blood relatives in years. Some of them found more family in a leather vest than they ever found at a dinner table. Maybe that's the whole point of this, Evelyn. Family isn't about who shares your last name. It's about who shows up. Evelyn managed a small, watery smile. You should write that down somewhere. Already did, Hawk said, tapping his temple. I don't forget the things that matter. That night, word of the lawyer's visit spread through the growing network of riders faster than anyone anticipated. And it did something unexpected. Instead of discouraging anyone, it seemed to harden their resolve even further. Big Tom Delacroix called Hawk directly, his voice tight with fury. You're telling me some vulture in a suit showed up asking about her money the same week we're organizing 200 people to show up out of love, Tom said. That just tells me we're doing exactly the right thing. Add my cousin's chapter to the list. We're up to 62 confirmed from Wyoming alone now. Renata called the next morning with similar news. I told the story at my hospice support group, she said. Half the room started crying. 3 more riders from Missoula just texted me. We're past 170 now, Hawk. It's not slowing down. The number on Hawk's kitchen notepad kept climbing through the following 2 weeks, 180, 190, 198. As word of Evelyn's story continued rippling outward through phone calls, through shared stories at diners and gas stations and hospice centers, through a growing recognition among total strangers that something rare and important was happening in a town most of them had never heard of before. But amid all that momentum, a different kind of complication arrived, one that had nothing to do with lawyers or town councils and everything to do with Evelyn's failing body. 3 weeks before the date they'd tentatively been planning around Evelyn's health took a sudden frightening turn. She woke one morning struggling to catch her breath, her chest tight, her lips faintly blue by the time Carol found her collapsed against her kitchen counter during a routine check-in visit. The ambulance ride to the regional hospital in Bozeman felt to Hawk like the longest hour of his life. He followed behind in his truck, breaking every speed limit on that highway, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, his mind racing with the same terrifying thought that had gripped him during her fall weeks earlier. What if we run out of time before the world gets to show her what it built? The doctors in Bozeman worked quickly, a mild heart episode. They explained not fatal, but serious enough that it demanded immediate attention and raised uncomfortable questions about how much time Evelyn Harper actually had left. Her heart is weak, the cardiologist told Hawk in a quiet hallway conversation, choosing his words with careful precision. At her age, with her overall condition, I want to be honest with you, we're not talking about years anymore. We could be talking about months, possibly less. Hawk stood frozen in that hallway, absorbing news that hit him harder than he expected it to for a woman he'd only known a matter of weeks. Does she know? He asked. I'm going to speak with her directly, the doctor said. But given what I understand you and your community have been planning for her, I'd encourage you to think about whether some of it might happen sooner rather than later. That single sentence changed everything. Hawk walked into Evelyn's hospital room to find her sitting up, pale but alert, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, and the moment their eyes met, she seemed to already understand something significant had shifted. Tell me the truth, Jackson, she said quietly. I've earned that much. Your heart's weaker than we thought, Hawk said, sitting down heavily in the chair beside her bed. The doctor's not talking about years anymore, Evelyn. He's talking about months. Maybe less. Evelyn absorbed this with a stillness that unsettled him more than tears would have the calm of a woman who had already in some private corner of her mind made peace with her own mortality long before any doctor confirmed it. Well, she finally said, I suppose that answers the question of whether I'll live to see all those people at my funeral. Hawk's throat tightened. Evelyn. I'm not upset, dear, she said gently, patting his hand with her uninjured one. I've had 95 years. That's more than plenty of people get. Her voice caught slightly. I just wish I could see it. All of it. Everyone you've told me about. I wish I could see their faces and hear their voices before it's my body they're standing over instead of my open eyes. Hawk sat with that thought for a long, silent moment, and something began forming in his mind, something that felt immediately both impossible and absolutely necessary. What if you could, he said slowly. Evelyn blinked at him. What do you mean? What if we didn't wait? Hawk leaned forward, his mind racing, now piecing together an idea faster than he could fully articulate it. What if we brought some of them to you? Not all 200, not yet, but enough. Enough for you to see it, to feel it, while you're still here to feel it. Jackson, that's not how funerals work, Evelyn said, though there was something flickering behind her eyes now that looked almost like hope fighting its way back to the surface. Who says it has to be a funeral? Hawk said. Who says we can't give you something before that? A celebration. While you're still breathing, still able to look every single one of them in the eye and know exactly what you mean to them. Evelyn stared at him, her chest rising and falling with the help of the oxygen tube tears beginning to slip silently down her weathered cheeks. You'd really do that, she whispered. Bring them here now instead of waiting. Evelyn, Hawk said, his own voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. I think we've had this backwards from the very beginning. We've been so focused on making sure you weren't alone when you died that we forgot the more important thing, making sure you know while you're alive exactly how loved you already are. He pulled out his phone right there in the hospital room, and this time instead of a message to chapter presidents about a funeral date months away, he typed something entirely different. Change of plans. Evelyn's heart is failing faster than we expected. We're not waiting for a funeral to show her what we built. Anyone who can make it to Silver Creek within the next 2 weeks, we're doing this now, while she's still here to see it. He hit send, and within minutes, the same network that had spent weeks quietly preparing for a distant, solemn occasion erupted instead with something entirely different. Urgency, immediacy, and an outpouring of commitment that arrived faster than Hawk had dared to hope. Big Tom responded within 3 minutes. Say the word. We'll be there in 4 days. Renata responded almost simultaneously. I'm rearranging my shifts right now. Tell her I'm coming. Frank Doyle's response came within the hour, simple and resolute. Already packing my bike. By the end of that single day spent from a hospital chair beside a dying woman's bed, Hawk Mercer watched the number on his phone climb in real time, in a way it never had during the slower, quieter weeks before, not for a funeral anymore, but for something that suddenly felt far more urgent, far more alive. A celebration for a woman who still had time left to feel it. Evelyn, propped against her hospital pillows, watched Hawk's phone buzz over and over, watched his face shift from grief to something fierce and determined, and for the first time since her diagnosis that morning, she felt something other than the quiet resignation she'd carried for 18 years. "Jackson," she whispered. "Yeah. How many days do you think you'll need?" Hawk looked up from his phone, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that told her without a single word that whatever time she had left was about to be filled with more love than she had ever imagined possible. "However many it takes," he said. "But Evelyn, I don't think it's going to take long at all. I think the whole world's been waiting for a reason like you to show up." Outside that hospital window, 200 miles away, and counting engines were already being checked. Vests were already being pressed, and a quiet, unstoppable current of strangers who had never met Evelyn Harper were already turning their bikes toward a small town in Montana that none of them had ever visited before, determined every single one of them to make sure she saw with her own eyes exactly how far one small, heartbroken sentence in a diner had traveled. Evelyn came home from the hospital 4 days later with a portable oxygen tank tucked beside her recliner and a nurse's phone number taped to her refrigerator. But she came home to something else too, a house that no longer felt like the quiet, forgotten place she'd lived in for 18 years. Carol had organized a small army of neighbors to clean the place top to bottom while Evelyn was still in Bozeman. Someone had mowed the lawn. Someone had fixed the porch step that had been loose since Frank died. And taped to her front door in handwriting she didn't recognize was a note that simply read, "We heard you're coming home. We're glad. Welcome back, Mrs. Harper." She stood on her porch reading that note 3 separate times before Hawk had to gently guide her inside, worried the cold air would aggravate her lungs. "I don't understand these people," Evelyn said, settling into her recliner with a small, disbelieving laugh. "A month ago, most of this town didn't know my name. Now they're mowing my lawn." "They knew your name," Hawk said, setting her oxygen tank within easy reach. "They just needed a reason to remember it out loud." That sentence, the same one Carol had spoken weeks earlier, had started circulating through Silver Creek like its own quiet gospel repeated at the diner counter, at the gas station, at the little hardware store on Main Street, until it had become something like the town's unofficial motto for the strange, beautiful weeks that followed. But Hawk didn't have time to sit with sentimentality. He had 11 days, maybe less, to turn a phone full of frantic messages into something real, something Evelyn could actually see with her own failing eyes, and the weight of that timeline sat on him like a physical thing. He called an emergency meeting that night, not of the whole network that was impossible on short notice, but of the core group who had been coordinating logistics from the very beginning. Renata drove in from Missoula. Big Tom conferenced in by phone from Billings, his voice booming through the speaker, loud enough that Evelyn, dozing in the next room, stirred slightly in her sleep. "We can't get 200 people here in 11 days, Tom said bluntly. "Not everybody. Some of these folks work jobs, Hawk. Some of them can't just drop everything on a phone call." "I know," Hawk said. "I'm not asking for 200. I'm asking for whoever can make it, even if it's 40, even if it's 60. She needs to see this now, Tom, not in some hypothetical future when she's already gone." There was a pause on the line, heavy with the particular grief of men who had spent their lives learning that time was the one thing you could never negotiate with. 60 I can promise you by next weekend, Tom finally said. More might trickle in after that. Renata, sitting across the kitchen table from Hawk, had been quiet through most of the call, her nurse's mind working through a different problem entirely. "There's something else we need to think about," she said. "Her heart. If this turns into something loud and chaotic, 200 motorcycles, crowds, noise, it could genuinely hurt her. We need this to feel like a celebration, not an assault on a woman with a failing heart." Hawk hadn't considered that, and the realization hit him like cold water. In his urgency to give Evelyn everything before it was too late, he'd nearly repeated the same mistake the town council had warned about weeks earlier, turning an act of love into a spectacle that could do more harm than good. "You're right," he said slowly. "We do this in stages, small groups, time with her that actually matters instead of overwhelming her all at once." Renata nodded, already pulling out a notepad of her own. "I can coordinate that. 20 minutes at a time, maybe 30. We give her real conversations, not just a parade she has to sit through. It was Renata, in fact, who insisted on something else, a house call from Evelyn's new cardiologist to establish exactly how much activity her heart could safely tolerate. And it was during that visit 3 days later that the timeline collapsed even further than anyone had feared. The cardiologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, sat with Evelyn in her living room, checking her vitals with quiet efficiency before delivering news that made Hawk's stomach drop through the floor. "Mrs. Harper," Dr. Patel said carefully, "I want to be honest with you the way I'd want someone to be honest with my own grandmother. Your heart function has declined more since your hospital stay than I'd hoped. I don't think we're talking about months anymore. I think we need to be prepared for this to happen much sooner, possibly within the next 2 to 3 weeks." The room went completely silent. Evelyn absorbed the news with the same eerie calm she'd shown before, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and measured with the help of her oxygen. But Hawk felt something inside his chest crack wide open, a raw, desperate panic he hadn't expected to feel this intensely. 2 to 3 weeks. They didn't have 11 days to plan a celebration anymore. They had maybe 10, and every single one of them mattered now in a way that made his hands shake as he reached for his phone the moment Dr. Patel left the house. "Change of plans," he said into the phone the second Big Tom picked up. "It's not weeks anymore, Tom. It might be days. We need whoever can come, and we need them here by this weekend, not next weekend, this one." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Hawk," Tom said quietly, "that's 4 days from now." "I know exactly how many days it is," Hawk said, his voice tight. "I need you to make it happen anyway." What followed over the next 96 hours was, by every account later given by the people who lived through it, one of the fastest, most extraordinary mobilizations any of them had ever witnessed. Tom canceled a family vacation without a second thought, texting Hawk a single line. "Already on the road, my brother," before dawn had even broken over Billings. Renata rearranged an entire week of hospice shifts, calling in favors from coworkers she hadn't spoken to in months, simply saying, "There's a woman in Silver Creek who doesn't have much time, and I need to be there." Frank Doyle, the retired Marine, loaded his motorcycle onto a trailer because his own bike hadn't run reliably in months, determined that nothing, not a broken carburetor, not 400 miles of highway, was going to keep him from Silver Creek that weekend. And it wasn't just the riders who mobilized. Word reached the young mechanic Danny Okafor at the exact moment he was closing up the auto shop for the night, and within an hour he had convinced 2 coworkers, neither of them bikers, neither of them part of any club, to drive up with him in his truck, simply because, as he put it, some things you don't need a motorcycle to be part of. By Thursday evening, less than 72 hours after Dr. Patel's grim prognosis, the first wave of riders began arriving in Silver Creek. Not 200, not yet, but a formidable 73, filling the town's single small motel to capacity and spilling over into the homes of residents who weeks earlier had worried about noise complaints and were now offering up guest rooms and couches without a second thought. Hawk stood on Evelyn's porch that evening, watching motorcycles roll into town one by one, their headlights cutting through the early dusk, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel amid all the grief and urgency, a fierce, overwhelming pride in what strangers were capable of when someone finally gave them a reason to show up. He walked inside to find Evelyn sitting in her recliner, watching through the window with wide, disbelieving eyes as headlight after headlight turned onto her quiet street. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are those—" "They're here for you, Evelyn," Hawk said, kneeling beside her chair, taking her frail hand in his. "Not later. Not at some funeral you won't get to see. Right now, while you're still here to look them in the eye." Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, and for one terrifying moment, Hawk thought her heart might actually give out from the shock of it. But instead, slow tears began sliding down her weathered cheeks, and a sound escaped her that was half sob, half laughter. The sound of a woman who had spent 18 years believing she'd been forgotten, watching proof arrive on her very own street that she never had been. Renata was the first through the door, kneeling immediately beside Evelyn's chair, wrapping her arms gently around the fragile woman she'd only met once before weeks earlier, in a hospital room 200 miles away. "I told you I'd come," Renata whispered. "I meant it." Behind her came Frank Doyle, removing his cap the moment he stepped through the doorway, his eyes glistening as he took Evelyn's hand in both of his. "Ma'am," he said, "I drove 400 miles because a story about a woman I never met made me feel something I hadn't felt since I lost my wife. I wanted to say thank you in person while you could still hear it. One by one, they came through that small living room. Riders Evelyn had never met, introducing themselves with a gentleness that belied their leather vests and weathered faces, each one carrying some version of the same message. You mattered to me before I ever met you. Your story changed something in my life. I needed you to know that while you're still here. Big Tom Delacroix, when his turn came, knelt his enormous frame down beside her chair with surprising tenderness, and when he spoke, his booming voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. My grandmother died alone in a nursing home 11 years ago, he said. Nobody came. Not even me. I was working. I told myself I'd visit next week, and next week never came in time. I've carried that shame for 11 years, ma'am. When Hawk sent that message about you, I promised myself I wasn't going to let that happen again. Not to anybody if I could help it, especially not to you. Evelyn reached up and touched his weathered cheek with her trembling hand. Then your grandmother, she said softly, would be very proud of the man sitting in front of me right now. Big Tom, a man who had ridden through blizzards and buried more brothers than he could count, without shedding a public tear, broke down completely in Evelyn Harper's living room, his enormous shoulders shaking as decades of guilt finally found somewhere to go. The house filled slowly, carefully, exactly the way Renata had insisted. Small groups, gentle conversations. Nothing that would overwhelm a heart already stretched thin. Outside, more riders waited patiently in the yard on the porch along the quiet street, taking their turns without complaint, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to Evelyn, not to any of them. Danny Okafor, the young mechanic, waited nearly 2 hours for his turn, and when he finally knelt beside Evelyn's chair, he seemed suddenly shy, uncertain what to say to a woman 3 times his age whose story had upended his entire month. I'm not even fully patched in yet, he admitted. I'm 26. I probably don't have any business being here at all. Nonsense, Evelyn said, patting his hand. You came. That's the only qualification that's ever mattered. Danny hesitated. I guess I wanted to say my own grandma's in a home in Great Falls. I don't visit as much as I should. Your story kind of woke me up to that. I'm going this weekend. After this, I wanted you to know you did that. Evelyn's eyes filled with fresh tears. Then perhaps, she said, the greatest gift I could give isn't anything happening in this room tonight. It's you walking through your grandmother's door this weekend while she can still see your face. By midnight, exhausted but radiant, in a way Hawk had never seen her, Evelyn had spoken with all 73 riders who had made it to Silver Creek in that impossible 72-hour window. She sat in her recliner oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, surrounded by empty coffee cups, and the lingering warmth of dozens of strangers who had become, in the span of a single evening, something that felt remarkably like family. Jackson, she said quietly as the last of the riders finally said their goodnights. I think I understand now. Understand what? Hawk asked, settling into the chair Renata had occupied hours earlier. I always thought love had to come from people who'd known you your whole life. Family, old friends, people who watched you grow up. Evelyn's voice was weak but steady. But every person who walked through that door tonight had known me for exactly one conversation, sometimes less. And I don't think I've ever felt this loved in my entire life. Hawk reached for her hand. Maybe that's the whole secret nobody ever tells you, Evelyn. Love isn't about how long you have known somebody. It's about whether you show up when it matters. But even as that beautiful night wound down, even as Evelyn finally drifted to sleep in her recliner, with a smile Hawk hadn't seen on her face since he'd met her, a new crisis was already unfolding 2 counties over. One that would test everything they'd built in ways none of them anticipated. The remaining riders, the bulk of the network, Hawk had spent weeks organizing. The additional 130 who hadn't been able to drop everything within 72 hours, were still making their way towards Silver Creek, converging from 4 different states along mountain highways that had, without warning, become treacherous. A sudden early snowstorm swept down from the Canadian border that same night, dumping 6 inches of wet, heavy snow across the mountain passes that dozens of riders were currently traveling, turning what should have been a straightforward ride into something genuinely dangerous. Hawk's phone began buzzing at 2 in the morning, jolting him awake in the guest room Evelyn had insisted he use rather than driving back to his own place exhausted. It was Big Tom, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Hawk, we've got a problem. Riders are stranded on Highway 12, maybe 20 of them caught in the storm. Visibility's near zero. 2 bikes have already gone down. Nobody's seriously hurt, thank God. But this is bad, Hawk. This is really bad. Hawk was out of bed and pulling on his boots before Tom even finished the sentence. Where exactly, he demanded. Mile marker 40, maybe 45. They're pulled over trying to wait it out, but the temperature's dropping fast, and some of these guys don't have the gear for this kind of cold. Hawk's mind raced through every worst-case scenario. At once, hypothermia. More crashes, a tragedy that would turn this entire beautiful movement into something unbearably dark. Something that would follow Evelyn's story forever, as the moment love turned into loss. I'm calling the sheriff's department, Hawk said. We need plows, we need warming shelters, we need it now. What followed was a frantic, adrenaline-soaked scramble that stretched through the remaining hours of that night. Hawk on the phone with Silver Creek's sheriff, who mobilized snowplows faster than anyone expected, given the town's earlier hesitation about the whole endeavor. Renata coordinating with a small hospital in the nearest town to prepare for possible hypothermia cases. Residents of Silver Creek, the very same people who had worried about noise complaints weeks earlier, now opening their homes as emergency shelters for stranded strangers they'd never met. It was nearly 5 a.m. before Hawk finally got confirmation that every stranded rider had been located, warmed, and accounted for, bruised, exhausted, shaken but alive, and remarkably still, determined to continue towards Silver Creek the moment the roads cleared. When Hawk finally allowed himself to breathe, sitting in his truck outside the sheriff's station, as dawn began breaking gray and cold over the mountains, he thought about how close they had come in a single terrifying night to turning an act of love into a tragedy that would have shattered everything they'd built. He thought about Evelyn asleep in her recliner, unaware of how close disaster had come to reaching her doorstep before it ever had the chance to bring her joy. And he thought with a fierce and sudden clarity about how fragile this whole beautiful thing really was. Not just Evelyn's heart failing quietly in her chest, but the entire delicate structure of hope that had been built around her, one phone call, one motorcycle, one act of unexpected kindness at a time. By the following afternoon, the storm had cleared, the roads had been treated, and the stranded riders, chastened but unbroken, resumed their journey towards Silver Creek, arriving battered and exhausted but whole, their numbers now swelling the town's population in a way nobody could have predicted weeks earlier. Evelyn, informed only afterward of how close disaster had come, sat very still when Hawk finally told her the full story, her hand pressed against her chest. They almost died, she whispered, coming here for me. They didn't die, Hawk said firmly, taking her hand. They're fine, Evelyn. Bruised, cold, exhausted, but fine. And not one of them regrets it. I already asked. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Hawk hadn't heard from her before. I need to see them, she said. All of them, however many make it here. I need to look every single person who risked something for me in the eye and thank them properly while I still have breath left to do it. You will, Hawk promised. I swear to you, Evelyn, you will. Outside her window, the sound of motorcycle engines had begun again. Distant at first, then closer. A low rolling thunder building steadily across the valley as riders who had survived a mountain snowstorm turned the last miles toward a small town in Montana and the 95-year-old woman waiting there, to finally see with her own eyes exactly how far her quiet heartbreak had traveled. And somewhere in that gathering thunder of engines, nobody yet knew just how many more were still coming, because the number climbing steadily on Hawk's kitchen notepad had in the last 48 hours alone nearly doubled beyond anything even he had dared to imagine. Thought for 2 seconds. By Saturday morning, Silver Creek, Montana, a town of fewer than 900 people, had somehow absorbed nearly 200 visitors without anyone quite understanding how it had happened so fast. The motel was full, guest rooms were full, the church basement had been converted into makeshift sleeping quarters, with Pastor Ellis Warner, one same young pastor Evelyn had once said didn't even know her name personally, hauling in cots donated from 3 different counties. Somewhere along the way, in the chaos of the storm and the scramble that followed, an entire town that had once worried about noise complaints had transformed into something resembling a small, determined army, all mobilized around a single purpose. Making sure Evelyn Harper saw this before her heart gave out. Hawk stood on her porch that morning with a clipboard in hand, something Renata had insisted on after the chaos of the first evening, a schedule now organized in careful 20-minute blocks, so that Evelyn's fragile heart wouldn't be overwhelmed by too much emotion, crammed into too little time. You look like a man running a military operation, Evelyn said from her recliner, watching him through the screen door with obvious amusement. I'm running an operation, Hawk admitted, stepping inside. Just not the kind I'm used to. Usually there's a lot less crying involved. Evelyn laughed, a real laugh brighter than anything Hawk had heard from her since the diner. And for a moment, the oxygen tube and the frailty and the doctor's grim 2 to 3 week prognosis all seemed to fade into the background of a woman who, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, felt entirely undeniably alive. The first visitor that Saturday morning was a woman named Loretta Simmons, part of a chapter that had ridden in from Idaho overnight after hearing about the storm and refusing to let it stop them. She knelt beside Evelyn's chair, her leather vest still damp from the previous night's weather, and before she even introduced herself, she began to cry. I'm sorry, Loretta said, wiping her face with the back of her glove. I told myself I wasn't going to do this. I promised myself I'd hold it together. Nonsense, Evelyn said gently. Tell me why you're really here, dear. Not the version you rehearsed in the truck. Loretta let out a shaky breath. My daughter died 2 years ago. Car accident. 23 years old. And when she passed, I sat in that funeral home just like you did, except I already knew. I already knew almost nobody was going to come because she'd moved across the country for work, and none of her new friends really knew our family yet. I sat through her funeral with 11 people in the pews, Mrs. Harper. 11, Ohio. And I've carried that shame for 2 years, feeling like I failed her. Like I didn't raise her with enough people around her who'd show up. Evelyn reached out and took Loretta's trembling hand. That wasn't your failure, Evelyn said firmly. That was the world's failure. The same failure that almost happened to me if not for one man in a diner who decided to listen. I know that now, Loretta whispered. That's why I'm here. Because nobody showed up for my daughter the way people are showing up for you, and I couldn't sit at home knowing there was a chance to make sure that never happens to somebody else again. Not while I could still do something about it. Evelyn held Loretta's hand in both of hers, and for a long moment neither woman said anything at all. Two strangers bound together by grief and love, in a way that defied every ordinary rule about how relationships were supposed to form. That was the first mini-climax of the day, and it would not be the last because as the schedule unfolded through the late morning and into the afternoon, story after story poured into that small living room, each one peeling back another layer of pain that Evelyn's simple, heartbroken sentence had somehow reached and touched. A retired school teacher named Margaret Chen arrived at noon, her hands shaking as she described watching her own mother die alone in a hospital room in Seattle. Because Margaret had been 3 hours away at a work conference, she couldn't cancel in time. A young widower named Peter Ashby, only 31, spoke haltingly about losing his wife to cancer the previous spring and finding in the weeks since that grief made people disappear from your life exactly when you needed them most. Each story delivered in that small living room seemed to carry a piece of the same larger wound, a country full of people quietly terrified of dying, unnoticed of loving people who slipped away with too few witnesses, of a culture that had somehow forgotten how to simply show up for each other. And Evelyn, frail and failing, but somehow more present than she had been in years, absorbed every single story with the same fierce, undivided attention, as though each visitor's pain mattered exactly as much as her own once had. By late afternoon, Renata pulled Hawk aside in the kitchen, her nurse's instincts flashing warning signs she couldn't ignore. She needs to rest, Renata said quietly. Her color's not good. We've had 31 visitors today already, Hawk. That's more than her heart can safely handle in a single stretch. Hawk's stomach tightened. How many more are we turning away? At least 40 are still waiting outside, Renata admitted. But if we push her too hard today, we might not have tomorrow at all. It was Hawk realized the cruelest kind of math measuring love against mortality, trying to squeeze an impossible amount of connection into a rapidly shrinking window of time. He walked out to the porch where dozens of riders stood patiently in small clusters across Evelyn's yard and the street beyond, and he had to deliver news that felt like a small betrayal even as he knew it was necessary. Folks, he said, raising his voice enough to carry, I need you to hear something important. Evelyn's heart can only take so much in a single day. We're going to need to spread this out over the next several days rather than trying to get everybody through today. I know some of you traveled a long way and can't stay that long, and I am so sorry, I truly am. But I can't risk her health for the sake of a schedule. The response that followed surprised even Hawk. Instead of frustration, Instead of the understandable disappointment of people who traveled hundreds of miles only to be told to wait, a quiet, immediate solidarity rippled through the crowd. "Take my spot," called out a man near the back, someone Hawk didn't even recognize. "Give it to whoever's got the shortest time left before they have to head back for work." "Same here," said another voice. "I can stay through the week if I need to. Give the earlier slots to the folks who can't." Within minutes, without any coordination from Hawk at all, the waiting crowd began quietly reorganizing itself, those with flexible schedules, stepping back, those who traveled the farthest or had the least time to spare, being pushed gently to the front, an entirely unplanned act of generosity layered on top of the generosity that had already brought them all to Silver Creek in the first place. Hawk stood on that porch watching it happen and felt something in his chest swell with a pride so large it nearly hurt. That evening, after the last scheduled visitor had gone, and Evelyn had finally been allowed to rest in her recliner, exhausted but glowing, Hawk sat with her as the house grew quiet for the first time in over 12 hours. "I don't think I've cried this much in my entire life," Evelyn admitted, her voice hoarse. "Not even when Frank died. Not even when I lost Michael." "Good tears or bad tears?" Hawk asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The kind of tears you don't get enough chances to cry," Evelyn said softly. "The kind that come from finally understanding that your whole life actually mattered to people you never even got the chance to meet." She was quiet for a moment, staring at the ceiling, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something smaller, more vulnerable than Hawk had heard from her before. "Jackson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Always," Hawk said. "Do you think I wasted my life?" Evelyn's eyes glistened. "All those years alone, thinking nobody cared, thinking I didn't matter to anyone anymore, was that wasted time? Could I have had this feeling years earlier if I'd only known how to ask for it?" Hawk considered the question carefully before answering, because he understood in that moment that his answer mattered more than almost anything else he could say to her. "I don't think you wasted anything," he said slowly. "I think the world failed you for a long time, Evelyn. I think loneliness crept into your life the way it creeps into a lot of elderly folks' lives quietly, without anybody really noticing until it's already taken root. That's not your fault. That's not a waste. That's just what happens when a whole society forgets to check in on the people who gave everything to build it." He took her hand. "But I also think," he continued, "that everything that's happening right now, all these strangers, all these stories, all this love pouring into your living room, none of it would exist if you hadn't lived exactly the life you lived. Raised the son you raised, loved the husband you loved, fed a whole town during a flood 50 years ago. Every bit of who you are is what made this possible. So no, Evelyn, you didn't waste anything. You just had to wait a long time for the world to finally catch up to how much you deserve to be seen." Evelyn wept quietly at that, not from sadness, but from something that finally, after 95 years, felt like release. The following days fell into a careful rhythm. Small groups arriving in staggered shifts, Renata monitoring Evelyn's vitals with clinical precision, Hawk managing the growing logistics of housing, feeding and coordinating a small army of strangers who kept arriving faster than anyone expected. By Tuesday, the number had climbed past 160 confirmed arrivals in Silver Creek, with more still on the road. But it was Wednesday afternoon when the story took its sharpest turn yet, because that was the day a local news van from the regional station in Bozeman rolled into town, drawn by rumors that had finally traveled far enough to reach professional ears. A young reporter named Sarah Kowalski knocked on Evelyn's door with a cameraman in tow, her expression a careful mixture of professional curiosity and genuine emotion. "Mrs. Harper," Sarah said once Hawk had reluctantly allowed her inside, "we've been hearing incredible things about what's happening here. I'd love just a few minutes of your time if you're willing." Evelyn glanced at Hawk uncertain, and he gave the smallest nod, sensing that this moment handled correctly could carry her story even further than any of them had imagined. "What would you like to know?" Evelyn asked. "Just tell me," Sarah said gently, "in your own words, what this last month has felt like." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts, her oxygen tube rising and falling gently with each measured breath. "A month ago," she finally said, "I walked into a funeral home and told a young man I didn't need anything fancy for my burial. I just needed one person to show up because I genuinely believed in my heart that nobody else would bother." Her voice trembled slightly. I have spent the last week meeting more than 100 people who drove through a snowstorm, who canceled vacations, who took time off work, who risked their own safety just to prove me wrong. I don't have the words for what that does to a person who thought her life had already stopped mattering to anyone at all. Sarah's eyes glistened, and even the cameraman, a gruff older man who had filmed thousands of stories over his career, had to wipe his own eyes before continuing. What would you say, Sarah asked, to people watching this who might feel the same way you did, people who worry that when their time comes, nobody will be there? Evelyn looked directly into the camera, and something in her expression shifted. Not the frail, resigned woman from the funeral home a month earlier, but someone who had, against every expectation, found her voice again. I would say don't wait for someone else to say the words first. Evelyn said, her voice steadier now than it had any right to be. I only found this love because I finally admitted out loud how alone I felt. If you're struggling with that same fear, say it. Tell someone. You might be surprised how many people have simply been waiting for permission to show up. The segment aired that evening on the regional news, and by the following morning, it had been picked up by outlets in 3 neighboring states, then shared thousands of times across social media, carrying Evelyn Harper's story to an audience far larger than Hawk's original network of motorcycle chapters had ever reached alone. By Thursday, Hawk's phone had become nearly unusable, flooded with messages from riders as far away as Texas and Ohio veterans organizations, offering to send representatives, even a small group of nursing students in Denver who had organized a fundraiser in Evelyn's name to support hospice care for elderly patients without family. But amid all that growing attention, amid the swelling wave of strangers now converging on Silver Creek from every direction, a different kind of visitor arrived at Evelyn's door that same Thursday afternoon, one that made Hawk's blood run instantly cold the moment he recognized the sleek black sedan pulling into the driveway. Gregory Ashford, the attorney, stepped out once again, this time accompanied by a second man. Hawk didn't recognize, younger, nervous, clearly uncomfortable, holding a bouquet of flowers he seemed unsure what to do with. Mrs. Harper, Ashford began before Evelyn could even fully register who was standing on her porch. Given the media attention surrounding your situation, my client felt it was important to personally get off my property. Evelyn said, her voice sharper and stronger than it had been in weeks, fueled by an anger that seemed to draw energy directly from her newfound sense of self-worth. I told you people once already. The younger man stepped forward hesitantly. Mrs. Harper, please, I'm Robert Harper. I'm your husband's great-nephew. I know this looks bad showing up now after everything on the news, but I promise you, I just wanted to. You wanted to what? Hawk interrupted, stepping between Robert and the porch with a stillness that carried more menace than any raised voice could have. Show up now that she's famous, now that there's a story worth attaching your name to. That's not fair, Robert said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. I didn't even know she existed until my father mentioned her a few months back. I've been meaning to reach out. You just needed a news story to finally get around to it. Evelyn finished for him, her eyes hard despite the oxygen tube beneath her nose. 30 years, young man, 30 years of silence from your entire family. And you want me to believe your timing right now is a coincidence? Robert's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, something like genuine shame crossed his face. No, he admitted quietly. I suppose I can't ask you to believe that. He set the flowers down carefully on the porch railing, the same spot where Ashford's business card had been left weeks earlier. I'm not here for money, he said. I don't even want anything from your estate, if that's what you're worried about. But just watching that news story, seeing what people have been doing for you, it made me realize how badly my whole family failed you. I wanted to at least say I'm sorry, even if it's too late to matter. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her anger slowly softening into something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. It's not too late to matter, she finally said. It's just too late for it to matter in the way you might have hoped. I have a family now, Robert. A family bigger and more devoted than I ever imagined possible. If you'd like to be part of what's happening here, you're welcome to stay and meet some of them. But don't come to my door with lawyers and inheritance conversations disguised as concern. That's not family, that's opportunism wearing a nice suit. Robert nodded slowly. Chastened, and to everyone's surprise, he did stay not as a relative, claiming a place at the front of the line, but quietly, humbly at the back of the gathering crowd, Listening to strangers describe what Evelyn Harper meant to them, learning perhaps for the first time in his life what it actually looked like when people showed up out of love rather than obligation. By Friday, 1 week after the storm that had nearly claimed lives on Highway 12, the number of riders and supporters who had arrived in Silver Creek had swelled past 190, with reports still coming in of more on the way, some traveling from as far as Oregon and Colorado after seeing the regional news segment shared and reshared across their own communities. Evelyn's health, meanwhile, continued its slow, inevitable decline. Dr. Patel visited twice that week, each time delivering the same careful, honest assessment. Her heart was weakening steadily, and while she showed no signs of immediate crisis, the doctor gently reminded Hawk and Renata that time remained the one resource none of them could manufacture more of, no matter how much love surrounded her. On Friday evening, as the visiting hours wound down and Evelyn settled into her recliner for what had become her nightly ritual of reflecting on the day's conversations with Hawk, she said something that caught him entirely off guard. "I want to see all of them together," she said. "Not in small groups anymore, Jackson. All of them at once. Before I go." Hawk's chest tightened. "Evelyn, your heart." "My heart," Evelyn interrupted gently, "has been beating for 95 years, and it's going to stop soon whether I see them together or not. I would rather see everything this has become all at once with my own eyes, even if it costs me a few days I might have had otherwise. I don't want fragments anymore, Jackson. I want to see the whole beautiful thing." Hawk sat with that request for a long, heavy moment, torn between the medical caution that had guided every decision for the past week and the simple, undeniable truth that Evelyn Harper had earned the right to decide how she spent whatever time remained to her. "Let me talk to Renata," he finally said. "If there's any way to do this safely, we'll find it." That night, after Evelyn had finally drifted to sleep, Hawk sat at her kitchen table with Renata Big Tom on speakerphone and Dr. Patel, who had agreed to a late consultation given the urgency of the request. "If we do this," Dr. Patel said carefully, "it needs to be controlled. Outdoors if possible, so she's not confined to a small space with too many bodies and too little air. Short, emotional, yes, but not chaotic. And we need medical support standing by the entire time." "We can build something outside," Big Tom said immediately. "Give me 2 days, I'll have a stage built in her backyard, chairs, set up, everything organized so it doesn't feel like a mob scene." "I can coordinate the medical side," Renata added. "I'll have an ambulance on standby the entire time, just in case." Hawk looked around that table at the faces of people who a month earlier had been complete strangers to him and to each other, now bound together by a single fierce determination to give a dying woman exactly what she'd asked for. "2 days," he said. "We give her 2 days to see everyone who's made it here together all at once, and Evelyn gets to decide when." Outside across Silver Creek, motorcycles continued arriving through the night, their engines a steady, distant rumble against the mountain silence, carrying with them people who had no idea that in just 48 hours, they would all stand together in Evelyn Harper's backyard for a moment. None of them would ever forget a gathering that would test everything Hawk Mercer had built and give Evelyn Harper the one thing she had been most afraid she would never receive: the chance to see with her own eyes exactly how loved she truly was before it was too late to know it. Big Tom kept his word. 48 hours later, Evelyn's backyard had been transformed by dozens of volunteer hands into something none of them could have imagined a month earlier. Sturdy rows of borrowed folding chairs, a small wooden platform built from lumber, donated by the hardware store owner who'd once worried about traffic on Miller Road, and a single microphone stand, positioned exactly where Renata had approved, close enough to the house that Evelyn wouldn't need to walk far enough from the crowd that the noise wouldn't overwhelm her heart. Evelyn woke that morning weaker than she had been in days, her breathing more labored, her hands trembling, even as she reached for her tea. Renata noticed immediately, checking her vitals with quiet, practiced hands, her expression carefully neutral, in the way nurses learn to mask fear from patients who need calm more than honesty in a moment like this. "Her numbers are dropping, Renata told Hawk privately in the kitchen, her voice low. "I don't know if she has today and tomorrow both. I think we need to consider doing this now this afternoon rather than waiting." Hawk's chest tightened with a familiar, exhausting dread. "Is it safe?" "Nothing about today is entirely safe," Renata admitted. "But I think denying her this might be worse for her heart than the risk of giving it to her, and she's been asking about it since she woke up." I think the anticipation itself might be doing more damage than the moment ever could. Hawk walked back into Evelyn's room to find her already dressed sitting upright in a chair by the window, watching the backyard fill with strangers through the glass, her eyes bright despite the visible strain in every breath she took. "They're already gathering," she said without turning around. "I can feel it, Jackson. Today. It has to be today." "Evelyn," Hawk said carefully, kneeling beside her. "Your numbers aren't good this morning. If we do this and something happens, then something happens while I'm surrounded by everyone who ever mattered to me," Evelyn interrupted, finally turning to face him, her eyes fierce despite the fragility of her body. "Jackson, I have spent 18 years terrified of dying quietly forgotten in an empty room. If my heart is going to give out, I would rather it happen out there looking at every single face that came for me than in here waiting for a moment that might never come." Hawk held her gaze for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded because he understood finally and completely that this was no longer his decision to make. It never had been. "Today," he said quietly, "we do it today." Word spread through to the gathering crowd with startling speed, not through any announcement, but through the same quiet, instinctive network that had carried Evelyn's story across 4 states in the first place. Within an hour, every rider, every volunteer, every resident of Silver Creek who had come to witness this moment understood that they needed to be ready sooner than expected. By early afternoon, the backyard held more people than any of them had dared to count in advance. Chairs filled first, then the space behind them, then the sides of the house, then the street beyond, until finally Big Tom, standing near the porch with a handheld radio connecting him to volunteers directing the overflow, turned to Hawk with an expression of stunned disbelief. 210, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We just got final count from the road marshals. 210 riders plus another 60 or 70 townsfolk and supporters. She asked for one person, Hawk. Look what she got instead." Hawk stood on that porch looking out over a sea of faces, leather vests beside church dresses, veterans beside teenagers, strangers who had never met each other 3 weeks earlier, now standing shoulder to shoulder because one old woman's quiet grief had cracked something open in every single one of them. Renata wheeled Evelyn out onto the small platform in a borrowed wheelchair, her oxygen tank secured beside her, a blanket draped over her lap. Despite the warm afternoon sun, and the moment she came into view, a silence fell over that enormous crowd, so complete it seemed to swallow even the wind. 270 people, and not a single sound. Evelyn looked out over the gathering with an expression Hawk had never seen on her face before. Not disbelief anymore, because disbelief had worn itself out over the past 2 weeks, but something closer to pure, overwhelming reverence. The look of a woman witnessing something she genuinely believed was beyond the world's capacity to give her. Hawk knelt beside her wheelchair, adjusting the microphone stand so she wouldn't have to strain to be heard. And when he looked at her, he saw tears already sliding freely down her weathered face. "Whenever you're ready," he whispered. Evelyn drew in a slow, careful breath, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried across that silent crowd with a strength that seemed to defy everything her failing body should have allowed. "A month ago," she began, "I walked into a funeral home 3 blocks from this house and told a young man I didn't need flowers at my funeral. I just needed someone to come." Her voice trembled, but she pressed forward. "I believed with my whole heart that maybe 4 people might show up. I had made peace with that. I want you all to understand that I wasn't asking for pity. I had simply run out of hope that anyone still had room in their lives for an old woman nobody remembered anymore." She paused, scanning their crowd slowly, her eyes finding faces she recognized now. Big Tom, Renata, Frank Doyle, Loretta, Danny, dozens of others whose stories had become woven into her own over the past several weeks. "I don't understand many things about this world anymore," Evelyn continued. "It moves faster than I can keep up with, and it forgets things I never thought it would forget. But I understand this. I understand that somewhere between one broken sentence in a diner in this very moment, hundreds of strangers decided that a woman they had never met mattered enough to rearrange their entire lives. You crossed mountains. You rode through a snowstorm that nearly took some of you from your own families. You canceled vacations, missed work, drove through the night for someone who couldn't offer you a single thing in return except the truth of how she felt." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she had to stop, pressing a trembling hand to her chest, and the entire crowd seemed to lean forward as one silently willing her to find the strength to continue. I used to believe, she finally said, that family only meant blood, that love only came from people who'd known you your whole life. I have spent the last month learning that I was wrong about almost everything. Family is not something you were born into. Family is something you choose again and again every single time you decide to show up for someone who needs you. Every single one of you chose me, and I will carry that choice with me for whatever time I have left, and I suspect wherever I'm going next for far longer than that. A sound rippled through the crowd. Then not applause, not yet, but something quieter and more profound. The collective sound of hundreds of people trying to hold back tears and largely failing. Hawk stepped forward, then unable to stay silent any longer, and took the microphone gently from its stand. "Evelyn," he said, his own voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. When I sent that first message, I had no idea what it would become. I thought maybe a dozen people would show up, maybe 24 if I was lucky. I never imagined this." He gestured to the crowd stretching far beyond the yard, into the street, into a town that had transformed itself entirely around one woman's quiet courage. "But I think I understand now why it grew so large so fast. It's because your story wasn't really about you being alone, Evelyn. It was about how many of us are secretly terrified of the exact same thing. You just had the courage to say it out loud first." He turned to face the crowd. "How many of you," he called out, "came here because some part of Evelyn's fear felt familiar to your own?" A wave of hands rose slowly across that enormous gathering, dozens, then 100, then more, until it seemed as though nearly every single person present had lifted their hand in silent acknowledgement of a fear they had carried in one form or another long before they'd ever heard Evelyn Harper's name. Evelyn watched those hands rise with an expression of profound, aching recognition. And when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something resembling peace. "Then let this be the answer," she said, "to every single one of you, and to everyone who hears this story after today. You are not going to be forgotten. Not by the world and not by each other, as long as we remember that showing up is the only thing that ever really mattered in the first place." It was in that exact moment, and as the crowd began to finally release the emotion it had been holding, that Renata's careful eyes caught something that sent alarm shooting through her entire body. Evelyn's hand resting against her chest had gone rigid. Her breathing, already labored, suddenly caught and stuttered, and her eyes, wide with sudden confusion, searched frantically for Hawk's face. "Jackson," she gasped. "Something's—" Renata was at her side within seconds, checking her pulse with practiced urgency, her voice sharp and immediate. "Get the ambulance up. Here now, Hawk. I need you to help me get her flat carefully right now." The crowd, sensing catastrophe unfolding on the small platform, fell into a horrified, helpless silence, watching as the woman they had traveled hundreds of miles to honor now appeared to be slipping away in front of every single one of them. "Evelyn, stay with me," Hawk begged, cradling her head as Renata worked frantically to stabilize her breathing. "Stay with me. Do you hear me? You don't get to leave in the middle of your own sentence." Evelyn's eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on his face, and for one agonizing moment, it seemed as though the story might end there in front of everyone, with the crowd's love arriving mere minutes too late to matter. But then impossibly her hand found his weak but present, and her lips moved with effort around words that barely carried beyond the small circle gathered around her. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not yet, Jackson. I'm not finished." The ambulance Renata had insisted on keeping on standby arrived within 4 minutes, paramedics rushing through a crowd that parted instantly, silently. Every single person present, holding their breath as Evelyn was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, oxygen mask secured over her face, her hands still gripping Hawk's with a strength that defied everything her body seemed to be telling them. "I'm riding with her," Hawk said, and nobody argued. The drive to the hospital in Bozeman felt once again like the longest of Hawk's life, sitting beside a stretcher watching monitors beep with numbers he didn't fully understand but recognized as frightening, holding Evelyn's hand the entire way, while Renata worked alongside the paramedics with fierce, focused competence. Behind that ambulance, unprompted, unplanned, over 200 motorcycles fell into formation, following at a respectful distance all the way to the hospital, their engines a steady, protective rumble that Evelyn, drifting in and out of consciousness, seemed to register even through her haze. "Do you hear that?" Hawk asked softly, leaning close to her ear. "That's every single one of them, Evelyn. They're not leaving you, not now, not ever." A faint, exhausted smile crossed her lips before her eyes closed again. The hospital staff in Bozeman had never seen anything quite like it. A small town's worth of motorcycles filling their parking lot and the surrounding streets. Hundreds of people standing in respectful, worried silence outside the emergency room doors, waiting for news about a woman most of them had known for less than 2 weeks, but had already come to love as fiercely as family. Inside, Dr. Patel worked to stabilize Evelyn's heart, and the hours that followed stretched into an agonizing eternity, for everyone gathered outside phones, buzzing constantly, with updates passed from person to person, prayers offered in a dozen different forms by people who 3 weeks earlier had been complete strangers to each other, and to the woman now fighting for her life just beyond those doors. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Patel finally emerged, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, and Hawk, Renata, and the small crowd that had refused to leave the waiting room held their breath as one. "She's stable," Dr. Patel said, and a wave of visible relief swept through the room. It was a serious cardiac event. Her heart is significantly weaker now than it was even a week ago. "I won't lie to you, I don't think we're talking about weeks anymore. I think we're talking about days, possibly less." The relief in the room curdled instantly into something heavier, more complicated, gratitude that she had survived this moment, tangled together with the crushing certainty that time had finally truly run out. "Can we see her?" Hawk asked. "Briefly," Dr. Patel said. "She's asking for you specifically." And Hawk, she paused, something softening in her professional composure. "She's asking about all of them too. Everyone outside, she wants to know if they're still there." Hawk walked to the hospital's front entrance and stepped outside into the cold night air, finding exactly as he expected that not a single person had left. 270 people stood vigil in that parking lot, in the dark, in the cold, refusing to go anywhere until they knew Evelyn was going to be all right. "She's stable," Hawk announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But folks, I need to be honest with you, because she'd want me to be honest. The doctor says we're not talking about weeks anymore. We're talking about days." A collective quiet grief moved through that crowd, but beneath it, something else emerged too, a fierce, immediate resolve that surprised even Hawk in its intensity. "Then we don't leave," Big Tom said, simply, his voice carrying easily across the lot. "Not one of us goes anywhere until this is finished one way or another." She doesn't spend whatever time she has left wondering if we meant what we said. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, immediate and unanimous, and within the hour what had been a spontaneous vigil transformed into an organized presence. Riders taking shifts, ensuring the parking lot was never empty, that Evelyn, whenever she woke, would see through her hospital window that the family she'd found had not gone anywhere at all. Evelyn spent 3 more days in that hospital, drifting between rest and brief, precious moments of clarity, and in each of those moments she asked the same question and received the same answer. Are they still there? Still there, Evelyn, every single one. On the third night, with Hawk sitting beside her bed and Renata monitoring quietly from the corner, Evelyn's eyes opened with unusual clarity, and she looked at Hawk with an expression of profound, peaceful certainty. "Jackson," she said, her voice weak but steady, "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Hawk said. "When it's my time, and I think we both know that's coming soon, I don't want a quiet funeral anymore. I want everyone who's still here. I want the sound of every single motorcycle you can gather. I want Silver Creek to hear exactly what it sounds like when a promise gets kept." "You'll have it," Hawk said, his voice breaking. "Every single engine, Evelyn, I promise you." She smiled and reached up weakly to touch his face. "You kept every promise you ever made to me, Jackson Mercer. Starting in a diner booth when I didn't even believe you. Thank you for proving an old woman wrong." Evelyn Harper passed away peacefully 3 days later in the early hours of the morning, with Hawk holding one hand and Renata holding the other, surrounded not by silence, but by the distant, comforting hum of motorcycle engines idling in a parking lot outside belonging to people who had refused until her very last breath to let her believe she was alone. The funeral, held 4 days later at St. Andrew's Cemetery outside Silver Creek, became something the town would speak of for generations. 210 motorcycles arrived in perfect formation, engines cutting to silence in unison as they reached the cemetery gates, riders removing their helmets and bowing their heads in a corridor of quiet reverence that stretched from the entrance all the way to the grave beside Frank Harper's, where Evelyn had asked to be laid to rest decades earlier, back when she'd still believed love only lasted as long as the people who remembered to show up for it. Hawk stood at the graveside, Evelyn's handwritten note, the one she'd dictated to Renata in her final days, folded carefully in his vest pocket, and when it came time to speak, his voice carried clearly across a crowd that had grown by that final day to include not just riders, but nurses, veterans, school teachers, an entire town, and even Robert Harper, who had stayed in Silver Creek every single day since his family's shameful first visit, finally understanding what it meant to actually belong to someone. Evelyn Harper, Hawk said, believed she would die forgotten. She was wrong about almost everything else in her final month, but she was most spectacularly wrong about that. She taught every single person standing here something we needed to learn before it was too late to learn it for ourselves, that family isn't blood and it isn't obligation. And it isn't the people who happen to share your last name. Family is the people who show up. And Evelyn Harper, in her final weeks on this earth, built the largest family any of us have ever witnessed out of nothing but one honest, heartbroken sentence spoken in a diner booth. He looked out over that vast, silent crowd at faces wet with tears, at leather vests standing shoulder to shoulder with church dresses at him, an entire community that had rearranged itself permanently around the lesson Evelyn Harper's life had finally taught them. She asked for one person to come. Hawk finished, his voice steady despite the tears finally slipping down his own weathered face. 210 of us showed up instead, and every single one of us walked away from this story loved a little bit more than we were before we ever heard her name. Family is not always the blood that runs through your veins. Sometimes it arrives on two wheels wearing black leather, answering the quietest cry for help with the loudest, most unforgettable act of love this country has ever witnessed. And that love, once given, never truly disappears at all.